I want to start by thanking, first of all, NYU for the invitation and the chance to share the film and to share the stage with some very distinguished colleagues who I also thank for accepting this invitation, and to Bonnie for capturing the stories and working on this, and to some Promundo colleagues who worked with us both on this story and on some of the research that I'm going to share with you. I wish that I could say on behalf of my Promundo colleagues that we came to the issue of thinking about caregiving, connecting men in relationships of caring as a brilliant insight to move ahead on our work, but it was really honestly an act of desperation. Watching intervention after intervention run into walls of what it could achieve if it was only education, only income generation, or only instructional in some way, if we didn't also tap into this emotional part and not simply talking about it, but finding ways that men and boys could live that. So I'm going to talk about how our journey to coming to the programming that we're trying to do in some of the world's most violent places. And then I'm thrilled to be able to share the stage with some colleagues to think together on where do we move ahead on these issues. I'm going to start with a little sobering data point that goes together with what Bonnie shows in the film, which is when I was writing a book that I wrote called Dying to Be Men in 2004, it talks about a lot of the reality of young men in favelas in Rio de Janeiro. Came upon census data in Brazil that showed that there were 3 million missing men. And I'll tell you what I mean in a moment by that missing men figure. We looked again in 2014, that is this year, looking at the numbers. That's now reached about 4.2 million missing men. And by missing men, what I mean, these are men, there are 4.2 million more women than men in Brazil. That's a demographic curve that doesn't happen naturally. That's not a biological phenomenon. Most of that excess male mortality, as demographers call it, is the first two principal causes are homicide and in second place, traffic accidents. The 50,000 homicides a year that Bonnie reported has been a fairly stable number, dropped a little bit per capita since the mid-1980s. The accumulation of that over the years leads to this excess male mortality. Again, as these are men who should be here. Their lives cut prematurely short. These are brothers and sons and partners and husbands and football players and would-be union leaders who should be with us today. And I think it is important just to get a sense of what does that mean to have such high and persistent rates of homicide. We see numbers like this in parts of the Caribbean. We see numbers like this in some urban areas in the US and some other parts of the world that are in war. So I think it is important just that we take first a look at that number. Globally, there's about 400,000 deaths by homicide a year, about 80,000 deaths a year from suicide, and goes between 40 and 50,000 deaths a year from armed conflicts. 80% of those who die from those three causes are men, and in the case of homicide and conflict, those who carry out the killings, the homicides, about 90% of those are men. We might be tempted, thinking about these sobering numbers, to say there's something biological about being male that leads to these high rates of male homicide and male use of homicide. But we start our work with the assumption and listening to data, whether it's Niobe Way, an NYU professor of development, or evolutionary psychology, or even Darwin, that says actually we are biologically programmed for connection. We thrive and live and strive not to hurt each other and cause harm to each other and to kill each other, but in fact we are biologically programmed, as Bruce Perry, the neuroscientist, says, we are born for love. The killing part of it is something that takes a huge amount of effort to turn young men into killers. Ask anybody who's been a drill sergeant, ask anybody who has worked in a military. And when we look at the data that we have from looking at young men involved in combat, young men involved in gang activities, it is a huge effort of trauma and stigma and shame and shaming and the rupture of the most basic and meaningful human connections to make young men into killers. So it is important as we start work in these kinds of settings to remember, as Darwin told us, that the human propensity, I'm paraphrasing, but the human propensity for living together is far bigger than any human propensity that there might be for causing harm to each other. Let's talk a little bit about, I started with some numbers of those who die every year, those who are killed every year, but let's talk about what conflict and these high persistent rates of homicide mean for communities and families, and I'm going to focus a bit on what it means for men. We've been doing sample survey and qualitative research in a number of high conflict places around the world in the last years, and I'll share a few of those findings with you. One is a sample survey that we did in Eastern DRC, Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, representative sample in and around Goma. We found that half of men and 2/3 of women had lost some family member as a result of the conflict. We also found that 75% of men and about the same numbers of women say they're ashamed to face their family because they can't earn even enough for the most basic needs. And that number is about twice as high as it was before the conflict. For men in particular, we know what this means about pulling their sense of identity out from under them, and that's an issue that I'm going to come back to. Bosnia, where we've also done the same sample survey together with CARE, 1/4 of men were in a nationally representative sample. 1 in 4 men actively involved as a combatant in the Balkans wars in the early 90s. More than half of those had been displaced from their home of origin or lost their livelihood because of the conflict. Rwanda, where we did the same survey in 2009, 80% of men and equal numbers of women witnessed or directly affected by the genocide in some way. Rio de Janeiro, not a place that people think of as a war zone, but we've been doing interviews recently with children about their sense of safety in communities like Marcios and like Fumaças. One of the things that came out, and this was not something that we had fished around for or thought it was going to come out, was we asked, what scares you? One of the things that came out repeatedly in the qualitative interviews was men scare us. Men as a category of human being that some of us in the room happen to be, men scare us. The most frightening category of men was police, even more frightening than gang members. For those of us who hope to create safe environments for children, to think that half of those adults walking around are considered frightening and considered potential harm is a pretty disturbing finding. We've also been doing interviews with families surviving the violence. One of the things that comes out again and again and again is how childhood, particularly siblings of those killed in this conflict, lose their childhood. One young man that I interviewed, Renan, his brother was 2 when he was killed in one of the police interventions that you saw here in the film. And he said, after my brother was killed, my mother was traumatized. She was afraid of losing me. She spoiled me, but at the same time, she imprisoned me in our house. After all this, I don't want to talk about this anymore. I didn't want this to be my life. Renan's now a father, and I asked him kind of what he wants for his own son, and he said, of course he'll know the story of what happened to my son, but he said, I don't want him to have to be an activist like I felt I had to become. I want him to have the freedom that I didn't have. We're also doing a study with returning combatants, FDLR. These are families that were affected by the genocide. Some of them were involved in carrying out the genocide who fled into Congo after the Rwandan genocide. These are 145 interviews that we carried out with returning. They're being reintegrated into Rwanda as part of peace processes. They were recruited into the FDLRs as children. The average age of these men is 31. Most were 11 years old or younger when they were recruited into or sought shelter with the FDLR or other armed groups. Like the other men we interviewed in the DRC, most of them, 2/3 of them said they often felt ashamed to face their family because of lack of income. Most of them said they had an out, though, compared to other men in DRC. They could rob and steal. Their weapons gave them a way to acquire some sense of manhood that other men didn't have. They also described how their childhoods were equally and more severely curtailed. They said we didn't have childhoods. They were navigating childhood and coming of age both as victims and as perpetrators. And we saw that their survival came at a very high price. 1/3 of them showed symptoms of a very severe mental illness. Those who were recruited under the age of 15 had about twice that rate of showing some sign of a severe mental illness. As one of them said to us, we saw terrible things. I'm sure that we are not safe in our hearts. Something must be wrong there in our hearts. So how do we think of these settings? I know that I've presented some data from some of the most challenging places in the world that one could work. I don't think it's only in places like this that we see this. We know the number of children in Washington, D.C. We'll hear about some examples from the Caribbean, many parts of the world where the witnessing of multiple forms of violence is daily. What does it take then to recover, and how do we understand breaking cycles of violence? One of the issues that we noted sort of again and again and again, I'm going to paint some similarities between the settings. Of course, there are huge differences of what this violence means, the countries, the settings, what the opportunities exist. There's huge differences that I'm glossing over for a moment to tell you one thing that's been a very strong constant. As we interview women and we interview men, we see a stark difference of how they respond and react and recover from trauma. Men are more likely to drink, to use violence against others, to abandon families, to close into themselves, to contemplate or to carry out suicide. I don't mean to imply that women are somehow getting along well. If we look at things like sexual violence and all the weight of family survival on their shoulders, they're not somehow surviving well. But we do see they find a way to get on by doing the daily work of caring for others. We often see that there is a positive mental health effect of women getting on with the daily act of the care of others. Where we begin to find some bright lights in all of this, you saw two of the stories here, is that the men who seem to be coping and faring better, getting beyond trauma and getting on with their lives in some ways, almost always reported to us a case of feeling a meaningful connection when they were responsible for caring for others. Reporting that somehow there was a connection, someone they were responsible for and felt the depth of that bond was a source of getting ahead. And I'll give you examples of two of those men, and then I want to come to a close so we can share with the group here. One of those is a young man, now 30. His name is Oswald. He worked with us he was actually part of the study that I mentioned. He was one of the interviewers. He was 8 years old at the time of the genocide. His family's Tutsi. They sought refuge in a church. His parents were killed, all but one of his siblings was killed. He survived. His father yelled at him in the last moments of his father's life, telling him to hide under the corpses to pretend that he was dead. He survived. He received help in Europe. He lost a leg as a result. He has a prosthetic leg. He also lost movement in one arm. With that recovery, he came back to Rwanda. He met an aunt. He reconnected with an aunt and also found a sister who had survived. Made it through secondary school, made it to university. He made it to university at the wave of the first genocide orphans. Lots of young people who, as we know, those of us who are parents of adolescents or children, know how much support they need for a very long time. He didn't have that support. One of the things the orphans group did was identify surrogate parents. They nominated amongst themselves young men and young women to be mothers and fathers. He was all of a freshman, 18, 19, and they nominated him to be a father. And he said to me when I had the chance to interview him, he said, it was a very big responsibility. I needed somebody to call me a father. I was worried, could I do this? But as I started to do it, I was proud, and it helped me. Everywhere I was a father. I thought, I have to behave like a father. Oswald is now an advisor to the Ministry of Education in Rwanda, and he credits this experience with being a caregiver, having to care for the others around him who also needed the support, as giving him the strength to carry on. 20 years after the genocide, last month, many of you know it was the 20th anniversary, or the 20th commemoration is a better way to call that, of the genocide, he became a father. And he sent an email, it was almost to the same week that his family had been killed at the beginning of the genocide, and he wrote to Pramunda's regional coordinator in Africa, our colleague Henny Slag, and he said, Henny, I became a father. I cannot tell you how much joy I feel. Thinking of those horrible days, I now stand well, comforted by my little daughter. If one thinks that one has a bad day, think a little bit about Oswald, and somehow challenges that we may face seem far different. Tell you about another colleague that we had the chance to interview who's also been part of work that we coordinate in the Balkans region. His name is Sirjan. He's son of a captain in the Serb forces in Bosnia, that is part of the Serbs in Bosnia, who were, as many of you know, part of the same forces who made Sarajevo and parts of Bosnia a living hell during the 1990s in the Balkans War. His family was displaced. His father was part of the combat. After the war, his brother also joined the military. His brother, also traumatized by this, committed suicide, which Sirjan witnessed. Surgeon said he thought of leaving his family, thought of trying to get out of the country. He thought life didn't really have much meaning. And then two things happened to him. One, he became leader of an informal peace camp that brought together young men from around the region. And he also became a father. It sounded like in the interview he didn't plan for that to happen. Funny how that happens occasionally. He didn't plan for it to happen, but it did. And he talks about living in the ongoing we know has not ended in the Balkans, and he said, here's what they say about the peace camp that he runs. Half the village sees the benefit of the peace camps, and they love me, and half the village hates me. They say I'm bringing drug addicts and foreigners. They distrust anyone who is not like them. Surgeon says the moment that he feels like he can face the hate that's there is when he goes with his 4-year-old son and takes his 4-year-old son to be part of the peace camp activities. And not by coincidence, Surgeon named his 4-year-old, he named his son after his brother. In interview after interview, we've seen men tell these stories, caregiving, connecting to others, finding the sense of meaning in the daily care of others, gave them ways to get through some of the worst situations that many of us could imagine here. What do we do with that? And I want to talk some more with the panel on kind of where do we go with this? It would be easy to look at these stories and think that they're only stories of individuals, but we're trying to figure out how do we take these lessons and turn them into things that we can do to change the structures that are out there. And I think it is important to acknowledge that there are some things we can do. Certainly what we've seen with young men is that it's not only needing jobs for the income's sake, but needing jobs for the identity that it gives, the sense that I have a social purpose, the sense that others respect me. We could go back in our country and think about things like the New Deal that kept men at work, and we didn't worry about how much they brought in the short term. We found ways to say, we need you to feel meaningful, connected. We need you to feel you can be breadwinners and connected to your families. Let's not worry about the economic return just yet, because we know what happens if we don't engage you. We need to think about holding accountable a security system that treats almost everyone who breaks the law as terrorists these days. We see what happens on the streets we can fill in the blank of cities in the US. We see what happens in Brazil. I won't even talk about the incarceration policies we need to think about. We need policies that support families with living wages and parent training, the kinds of stuff we're trying to do in Rio. All of that, we need to think about how do we build communities of care. Now, to certain policymakers, that might sound like really squishy, soft stuff that we might shrug at, but there are meaningful ways that we can do this. There's programs like the Roots of Empathy that tries to make the classroom a caring community, not a control and competitive community. There's the stuff that we do here. You don't see the rest of the documentary that will be on the air at the end of May, but we also show our work with the Brazilian health sector and in other countries where we've worked to figure out ways that we get men in the prenatal system into child care, having them be present from the very beginning. And yes, as Gilson says, we say if she wants pineapple, get her pineapple. We're doing all kinds of training to say, let's make the care of others just like them, that we men in the favelas are just like you, because there's so much prejudice that we live every single day. One thing we did, an idea of Marcio's and some others, we put cameras in men's hands in a community that's known for armed violence and all kinds of stuff that you saw in the video. We put cameras in men's hands and said, take men doing care work. We had hundreds of photos. They had no trouble finding them. We then put them up as posters at the entrance of Santa Marta, just right near Botafogo. If any of you know Rio, the entrance is right there. Big 2-meter sized posters of men doing caregiving. So the community itself, so the middle class world could look and say, they are just like us. And I think that's the other part of the care message, is to turn this around and say, we have our share of caring to exactly do that, to look at them and say, you're just like us. Those problems there are ours too. I'll stop there. I now get the fun part of asking these folks, Jenny, David, Peter, if you'll join me up here, let's have a discussion on what we do on this stuff. Really thrilled that all three of you could join. And I'll look to Michael to hold us on the time, because I think you'd find us talking for a very long time. Okay. So first, I'd like to all of you work on aspects of these topics. I talked a lot about Brazil and Central Africa and the Balkans, but I don't think the issues are too far off from the places that some of you are working. Jenny, of course, is the gender focal point at the World Bank. Peter Weller works on these issues as a therapist and researcher, and I'll call him an activist, even if he doesn't like that title, in the Caribbean, with the Caribbean Men's Network, among other things. And David Grosso is City Council member, also quite concerned and active in these issues. So I'd like to hear all three of you kind of give your perspective on it. So before I go into some specific questions, I just want to open it up to you and say, what's your take on the issues that we've laid out so far? What do we need to have adequate policies and programs? What do we do about this issue in this city that we're sitting?
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate being here. I appreciate everyone being here. I think it's a topic that we don't talk about enough. Certainly from my perspective here in the city, violence is at the core of a lot of the issues that I deal with on a daily basis. So whether it be education, healthcare, everyday existence, talking about police interaction, talking about prison sentences, returning from prison, school settings. There's a principal over in Anacostia, at Anacostia High School, who came in 2 years ago and told the police they weren't allowed to arrest students in the school anymore. And he reduced the arrests from 130 a year down to about 10, which were pretty important arrests, I think, if they were allowed at that point in time. And I think it goes back to what you were saying around missing men. We have a crisis situation in the District of Columbia that I think is not recognized enough, that goes way back here. And I think it's not uncommon to urban areas throughout this country and where poor people are located, starting with the Vietnam War, really. A lot of the residents in the district were drafted men and went off to fight, came back, either didn't come back or came back on some kind of substance abuse problem or mental issue. And these are federal policies that impacted our city just like they did around the country. This next one that was huge here was the war on drugs, and it's something that we're still grappling with every single day. The Just Say No campaign was targeted mostly in urban areas. The crack epidemic had a two-prong impact. One was people getting arrested all the time for small violations, and the other was the addiction and the loss of big parts of our community. On my street where I grew up, we had mostly grandmothers caring for kids of people that had gone missing in the crack epidemic. So now we're here in a new kind of era in the district where we have fewer murders per year. I think when I was a kid, we at one point almost got to 500 in the city of only 600,000 people. And yet at the same time, it's still an incredibly violent city. And it's not violent like the outward violence like you might think of, but it is every single day. There are police in the neighborhoods doing jump outs. There are school situations where children are being suspended and expelled at high rates. There is just not an environment of nonviolence and not an environment of caring that's really embraced. So if you want, I can talk a little bit about what I think is going on that we can change these things. One is there's an organization in D.C. working in our schools that deserves a lot of credit right now called the Flamboyant Foundation. They have adopted a new approach to engagement of parents and neighborhood and communities in schools. And what they said was the old model of come to the PTA meeting and this is when you're allowed to visit the school, and all of that is no longer working because it's just not the right relationship. And they're trying to create schools that are open and engage parents at a new level. So they actually go door to door. all summer long. They then open the doors to the school up and invite the parents and neighborhood in, and they have seen tremendous results in the city. They started out with just a few schools, and this year we have them in many more schools. I think there's, that's a huge step forward. That's what we have to do, is change, in my mind, the interaction between the government structures and the neighborhoods. And you talked a little bit about the us versus them mentality, and that's a huge issue here about, the government historically in our city was about employment, and that was about it. It wasn't about caring. It wasn't about engaging. It wasn't about community relations. And we still have this issue. I was at an event last night where it was a fundraiser for a charter school here in D.C. that deals with the poorest of the poor in our city. It's the Maya Angelou School. It's an outstanding school that is working with these kids really on the fringe. And they had a young man speak. He's a senior in the school, and he talked about when he was a freshman that the difference that he had from being in this caring environment. Well, what he witnessed as a child was somebody murdered in front of his house, the police reaction to that, which was just as violent as the murder itself. He pointed out something I think is relevant tonight. He said the two things that he had to overcome in order to get to where he was violent community and not having a father. And he pointed that out. He said, I don't have a father. So his grandmother was everything to him. He's now going off to college in the fall, and part of it was, he attributed to this, he said, the Maya Angelou School has a residential aspect that you can apply for. It's not for every child. He applied for that, and he had to convince his grandmother, but he figured the only way he was going to make it was if he got out of that situation he was in, even though she loved him and cared for him. And then in the residential facility, he recognized that there were caregivers 24 hours a day, helping him, get through the daily activities of life. We have to do that with a lot of our children, and then hopefully they have a better chance to survive. It feels more like it's a city of individual survival than it is a city of community survival. And so there's other, I think, smaller things we can do. Certainly, I'm looking for ways that I can better engage with the police to make their interactions less violent. I'm also looking for ways to encourage more parental involvement with a child's upbringing. And we've talked about this, and you certainly helped me. We introduced a law last month, and I think it's going to pass in the budget, that will give that'll basically give family leave to a whole long list. DC is unique. We're a very progressive city. We believe in human rights. We have a Human Rights Act. We have a human rights framework to what we do. So it's not hard to convince somebody to say, well, this equals parent. Well, it's actually a list that's about 15, different individual types, and then get them off. So we're trying to work that through the budget, where I pushed for 16 weeks. My staff and everyone else kind of laughed at me. If you have a baby, or if you adopt somebody, or if you're caring for a sick family member, right now you get 16 weeks of unpaid leave under the Family Medical Leave Act, but we would like to extend that to district and government employees at first. So I think it's going to pass in the budget. It might whittle down to 8 weeks, which would be more than most any other jurisdiction in the country, where we would actually give somebody who had a baby, for example, 8 weeks of paid leave to go be engaged in that child's life. So it's a big deal.
And that's both fathers and mothers.
That's everybody.
That's
it's
everybody.
fathers,
Right.
mothers, partners. We could go into a whole conversation about what family is, but it includes everybody in DC, and I think that's really important.
Cool.
So.
All right. Ginny, you work on gender and getting that woven into the bank's programming. And how do you see this nexus of gender and masculinities and violence play out? How do you find ways to program around that? Are there ways that you find within bank projects? Would love your take on this.
Okay. Well, thanks, Gary. Thanks for inviting me here this evening. It's great to be here. What I was going to do was just maybe preface briefly about what the World Bank does, and not have too much assumed knowledge, and then talk about some of the challenges I think that you've raised. So the World Bank Group is a major multilateral agency, around $50 billion a year, of which about 30 goes to governments and the rest to the private sector. And it brings a combination of knowledge, financing and also partnerships to the work that we do. We work in the lowest income countries in the world as well as in middle income countries like Brazil. And recently, some of you may know that the bank adopted 2 quite explicit twin goals, which are ending extreme poverty and boosting shared prosperity. And I think it's important to kind of step back and think about the agenda that we're talking about in that context, because I think a lot of it is around kind of inequality of opportunities and severe poverty. And so if kids are starting out with unequal opportunities and don't have kind of many of the possibilities and prospects, I think, that most of us assume, it's going to be very difficult for them. And certainly if left unchecked, you know, there's very little prospects for them in terms of education, let alone income earning later in life. And so kind of building that into the way that, for example, we support education programs is very important. I think the bank is one of the largest external financiers of education. So in Indonesia, for example, working with kids who are already out of school, a number of programs which are also designed in second chance sort of ways, so bringing kids in who have already dropped out. I was actually in Rwanda last week talking with girls who are participating in our adolescent girls program, and they were girls probably much like the colleagues that you were talking about in their early 20s who had finished school within the past couple of years. How many years of school did you finish? P6. So they'd finished 6 years of school only, so not more than elementary school in American terms, by the time they were 18 or 20 years old. So this was very much a kind of second chance program for them to come back and learn about kind of possibilities with technical skills and then move on from there. On the gender side, what we've been doing is trying to mainstream systematic consideration of gender disparities into the work that we do. And oftentimes in a number of low-income countries, if you're looking at basic things like kids in school, access to healthcare, jobs, it's girls and women who are disadvantaged. And so they're the kind of targets that we've been looking for in terms of getting girls back into school, getting women maternal care, and so on. We also try and push on kind of frontier areas. So violence is one of those. But I think more systematically, through the work, frankly, of Gary in particular and others, that there's a much greater recognition now of the importance of what we call adverse norms. So basically regressive social norms and attitudes which are held by women and girls as well as by boys and men. And I think that the power in the story from the documentary as well as from Gary's remarks is the ways in which these kind of norms and attitudes can be so pernicious in terms of people's aspirations and kind of prospects. And they're ones which, for example, normalize violence. They're ones which kind of limit people's aspirations as to whether or not they can finish school and what sorts of prospects they might have in life. They're often just as regressive in kind of gender terms, you know, among women and girls as they are among men and boys. And so I think thinking about ways in which this, you know, in many ways kind of vicious cycle can be broken is very important. And I think that the importance of the work that Tramundo and the Men Engage in Alliance have been doing is that it's getting us beyond kind of the hand-waving stage. Because I think that by now there's actually some recognition, but then trying to work out kind of what works and what can make a difference in terms of changing norms and changing attitudes. And we're just finishing a major report now on voice and agency, and one of the themes there is around violence. So clearly kind of violence, the acceptability of violence is very important. Another one is around sexual and reproductive health. And so there's quite a lot of evidence now about joint engagement of couples in kind of questions around sexuality and fertility decisions, that's much more likely to be effective than just trying to reach the women alone and get contraceptives to them alone. An agenda about reducing poverty and reducing inequality, which is manifested in different sorts of ways. And then with respect to the gender agenda, which is related to that, being more effective in the work that we do and recognising that the disparities can go both ways. And I think, I won't talk about Jamaica because in the Caribbean because we have an expert here, but that's one of the parts of the world where we have recognised that the gender disparities, certainly in schooling, kind of flipping the other way. And so we have kind of deliberate programs there to address that. We've had deliberate programs for some time in the former Soviet Union, for example, in the Russian Federation, where I worked some years ago, where there was excess male mortality. Less so, I think, from violence, or that was an issue, but much more from kind of alcoholism and kind of self-destructive behaviours, which can be very damaging as well.
Yeah, thanks. Peter, tell us about your work in the Caribbean, the context, how these issues, particularly of young men of color, play out, and ways forward that you see.
Well, first, thanks for having me here. Thank you, Gary, for organizing, and NYU. I think that it was very clear from the film how similar the dynamics are, certainly between the Caribbean and Brazil, in terms of the issues that are facing men and young men in particular. Now, you introduced me speaking about me as a psychotherapist and as a researcher and as an activist, so I'll make my comments on each of those headings. You know, the emotional component of this film is very powerful, and I'm glad that PBS has made it, and it will be, seen certainly with social media far and wide, because it speaks to the issues that we have to be very aware of if we are going to initiate interventions with men. I had an organization called the Caribbean Male Action Network, and a lot of the work we try to do is to intervene with men and young men to try to change their behavior. It's very important, therefore, that the state, all our stakeholders, the donor agencies, etc., really understand how complex behavior is, and that there are no magic bullets. And therefore, interventions take time and require considerable effort, and require an appreciation that the change process does not only include our target group in a favela, a slum, a middle class area, but it includes those of us who are trying to influence them. And sometimes we don't understand that we need to change also. Certainly, fora like this and collaborations like this are, indication that change is taking place. But I think that with my therapist hat on, I think it is very important to keep in mind that for many men, they have never had to even frame these experiences in a language. They have no cognitive schema for what is going on. And that is one of the powerful effects of interventions such like these that Promond is doing, and some of what we are doing by Kariman, etc., that we provide the opportunity for men to even understand what is happening, which is a prerequisite for change. We think also that the dynamics of group processes are far more powerful than many people realize. And again, it's evidenced very clearly here. This is not something that requires highly skilled, high intensity, high budget interventions. To be able to bring a group of men together and have them share, even in an unstructured environment, facilitates tremendous change. Again, it was exemplified in this film. And I think, therefore, the implications of those, these few comments I'm making under that heading, are that at the policy level, we really need to understand that we need to set the stage for these types of interventions. We need to facilitate the kind of partnerships and collaboration that will allow the civil society to join with the state, to work with the funding agencies in such a way that we create effective and efficient interventions. Now, with my researcher hat on, I therefore highlight the fact that one of the challenges we face is a multitude of very intuitive interventions. People trying their best to help because they see a problem. And we're challenged by the lack of data upon which to base evidence-based interventions. There's a lack of understanding that behavior change data is not something you get by counting the number of pamphlets or the number of participants. It's asking very hard questions as to why you did something, why you didn't do it, how it changed over time, who influenced you. And this requires resources, human resources and time. And I think that there is a dearth of this type of research. I can certainly speak to the by the people who you surveyed and interviewed, and then you publish it 3 years from now. What impact do you think that's going to have, especially if you're targeting young people? They've heard a new song, there's been a new craze, their behavior has changed, and you're totally out of whack. We have to find a way to ensure that our research is actionable in a timely fashion. And therefore, moving to my active we've got to find ways to move beyond some of these barriers that are right there, staring in our face. Facilitating collaboration, facilitating partnership, and trying to ensure that we keep our eye on the prize. I think there's no debate about what we're trying to achieve. We can take many approaches, but certainly as a man working in the field of gender, there are lots of spaces that you have to negotiate. There are men who want to take back the center stage and put women back in their place. There are women who see men as the enemy and don't trust men as valid partners. This is a major challenge. We have to create the spaces for these conversations, and certainly a space for public discourse like this is a critical initiative. Thank you.
Thanks. I want to open up now to, we've done a lot of talking. There's lots of folks in the room who work on these topics. I'd like to open up the floor to questions. So I don't know if we've got a mic in the back? Yeah. So let's take 4 questions. And if you want to, address it to one person, or otherwise, just put the question out there. We'd like to make this a dialogue.
While the mic's going over, I'll just ask you. Jill Gay, What Works Association. How would you scale up the really great work you're doing to be taken over by national governments, so that it's not just an NGO, sort of smaller scale? How do we scale this up?
Great. We'll take 3 more.
On the question, actually, of scaling up, obviously, this is, Brazil's a big country. It's a big world. We have a real problem of reaching people on a massive scale.
Yeah.
What we're really talking about is changing social norms, going back to the point that you made. This is a very, very difficult problem. How do we reach so many people, both men and women, girls and boys, and to change social norms? I wonder if there's been any thought given to the power of entertainment media. In Brazil, there have been telenovelas, for example, and similarly in Mexico. Telenovelas are potentially a great tool for establishing new social norms, creating positive role models for both boys and girls, men and women. And I'm just wondering if there's any thought being given to how soap operas can really help on a larger scale to address the very same type of questions and issues that have been raised here. Thanks.
Yeah, good.
It struck me while I was listening to you all talk. I was in Cuba a couple times, and I was back there in January. And, I grew up in fear in the United States in a perfectly good home. I taught my daughter, you don't walk alone. I've never felt safer anywhere than being in Cuba, except maybe Israel, because everyone's wearing a gun. And it's very interesting, because it's certainly terrifically poor. But I walked in the early morning, I walked by myself at night, we were in the countryside, in the cities. And I'm listening to you all talk and thinking, is there something to be learned there about what's going on in Cuba that's different? And what is different?
Yeah. Take one more, and then we'll open up.
Good evening. Thank you so much for the presentation and the film. It was really inspiring. My question is, you talked a little bit in the beginning about reaching out to lower income communities, and I'm just wondering, what does this look like in a middle and upper middle class community? I come from, part of my family is Indian, and it's a middle class community, and violence is throughout our family and our community not something that we talk about very openly. And gender norms are similar to what you're discussing, and it's not something that we talk about very openly. So I'm wondering, what does the framework that you're working on look like in a middle to upper middle class community?
Yeah, excellent question. So let's open it up and see who would like to comment. The first question was about scaling up. Peter, I don't know if you want to comment. I'll offer a couple of ideas, but I'll give you the chance first if you want to.
You know, speaking from on the ground, there are components to this. One of the components is the importance of having data that you can then use to sell and market the scale-up process. Yeah. The second component is something I mentioned earlier, which speaks to your advocacy and behavior change intervention at the level of the policymakers, so that they will be willing to accept what this scale-up process will require, because they have to make their changes to accept that. So that's, I think that kind of brackets it to a certain extent. I'll just leave those two comments out there.
Yeah. David, you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I think your second comment there is really important, and I find myself sometimes being the policy maker and sometimes being the activist at the same time, because to make change in these systems, you have to live that change. So if you believe it, you have to hire the right people, engage with other people, go to communities where you don't normally spend time. That's true for, I think, middle class, for poor people, for everybody. And once you've engaged in that conversation and put yourself out there as a leader, it's almost like activism. You're then in a better position, I think, to receive the change and the difference. Now, one area in particular that I think is going to be the hardest one we're going to have to do here in DC is the change around violence in the police force. And it's not just one police force. There's about 23 different police entities in the district. They all carry guns, they can all arrest you, and they all do. So the question is, how do you get past that? And I think we have to embrace an alternative to violence program, and then that has to be spread like wildfire. And I'm not sure how to get there yet. I'm looking for help with that. And then I'll just note one other thing. When I was in Brazil and visited your shop down there and met with your folks, they talked about the curriculum that you guys spread out throughout the country. And the curriculum is things like, and you could talk about it at length, but it really impressed me that it infiltrates the health centers, it infiltrates the schools, it infiltrates every community center to change the expectation. And I just think that's another way to go about doing it.
Jenny, do you want to comment on this? Going to scale is what the bank tries to do in many places with governments, of course. Yeah.
I think that the points that have been made are very well taken. I mean, in low-income countries, clearly financing can be a constraint as well as capacity. But I think having kind of the lessons from the smaller scale operations, having data and results that are persuasive, but also I think having a good sense about what might change when it goes to scale. Because frankly, some of the interventions that we do test are actually quite small. Might be 100 or 200 kind of participants. So the question is, if you tried to do it in all of Ethiopia where there's 80 million people, what would be different and what's different in terms of the conditions. So, I guess the comparative advantage of an agency like the bank is that the main client is the government. So working with the government, trying to persuade them and kind of bring them along. But it's always going to be very much a partnership. And I think particularly on these sorts of issues, kind of top-down itself is kind of pretty unlikely to work, particularly when kind of credibility may be lacking in the serious ways that you highlighted. But I think kind of the emphasis on kind of timely kind of data and sharing the results is critical to kind of inform policy making in a way that is useful.
Yeah. I'll comment just on a couple of ways that we're trying to do scale up. One is taking prenatal courses and getting them embedded into the public health system in Brazil. The MenCare campaign that's mentioned in the film has been officially adopted by Brazil's Ministry of Health. There's a men's health unit. And what it's done is, and we watch the rest of the film once it's on the air the end of May, it shows what you can do to change a notion that the birth of children is only women's issue. How do we get men involved from the very beginning? And filter out the possibility, or at least try to respond to the fact that just engaging men is not always an unmitigated good. We've also got up to 1 in 5 cases where a man has used physical violence against his partner. So Peter and I were talking earlier in the day, and he said we've got to be careful as we scale up that we be careful what we wish for. We've also got to make sure that we're scaling up the good stuff, not scaling up harm. So really trying to say, how do we work with the health sector to say this needs to happen, but to do it with all the precaution that needs to be there. I'm also thrilled that there's now, we're doing this together with the health sector in Rwanda as well. There's 1,700 fathers participating in birthing preparation classes. If you want to think of it as Lamaze for young, low-income rural farmers, in a culture where men aren't supposed to handle children until they're big enough to walk and kind of talk back to you. We worked with a women's cooperative to get kind of life-size dolls that have a bit of heft to them, because women said, we're not going to put babies in men's hands until you show us that they know what they're doing. So it's the kind of, and we said, absolutely, that's pretty smart, because babies need the neck held and all that stuff. So I think it's a question of, let's make sure that we've figured out what works. Let's try to get it out there. Let's do it with all the care that needs to be done. Let's take the time, and I think, I can't remember if this was Peter who was talking about just the complexity of it, how long it takes to do these things. Our collaboration with the health sector in Brazil has been a 6 or 7 year journey. And then, you kind of look back and wait, there's only 4 of the NGOs that have been part of this out of 7 at the beginning that still exist, right? So the long, how do we keep there as our role as civil society to keep pushing? So anyway, I just give those as a couple of examples. Let's turn now to some of the other questions that came up, the social norm change. I can comment on the telenovelas in Brazil, but want to hear some others. I think the broader question there is how to, the influence of the media. Are there ways that we can engage the media that presents, so much, whether it's the violence images, whether it's pornography, where are young people getting the messages, how might we change them? Peter, maybe I'll start with you, because you were talking about some very telling moments you had with young men earlier on where they're getting their images on gender relations and sexuality.
Yeah, it was a kind of X-rated conversation. I don't know if I can have it. But it's pornography. Pornography is some of the research we've been doing. We've been looking just at the porn sites and what are the most frequent, what comes up. For people who are not familiar with pornography, it would be very mind-blowing to see the kinds of images and issues that are raised. And then when you talk to the young people, you realize that this is where they're getting their information from about what's normal. Now, we can all discuss what we think is normal and should be, but the point is that they're getting this information without any intervention with anybody else who's explaining that maybe, well, those guys are taking Viagra. They've been selected with certain profiles. You don't have to feel inferior if you don't fit that profile. There are lots of dynamics that the women who have been selected, some of them are even drugged. Yeah. Which you can see sometimes in these images. So there's a lot of that kind of dynamic. In the Caribbean, we have a particular interesting issue in that we have a particular type of music originating in Jamaica called dancehall, which is a progeny of reggae. And some of dancehall has lyrics that are horrible, but very danceable and very popular. That's diffusing around the world, but in the Caribbean, the impact is palpable. It's normalizing aggression, violence, and many gender stereotypes. We are having a challenge in trying to engage the performers in a process of monitoring themselves, because they're saying, well, we're just talking about what's out there. But the dynamics are very interesting. I'll just give you one little example. I live in Trinidad. I'm from Jamaica. A lot of this music originates in Jamaica. There is music I hear played in Trinidad in the public space that you would never hear in the public space in Jamaica. It's seen as too vulgar, too rude, and too crude. But it is played in the public space in Trinidad. So, again, a complicated process that requires, first of all, an understanding of what is going on. I get back to the pornography. You can't handle it if you don't study it. You won't know what to do about it. Yeah. And then when it gets into the public space, there needs to be this discussion about the impact of these kinds of lyrics. So I'll just touch on those two.
Do either of you want to comment, particularly on the question was about how do we engage the media as a change agent, or how do we change the media, if that's either of you want to comment on that topic?
Well, I'm not an expert on the media side, but I just wanted to, on the norm change side, and I think that the work, documenting the power of the media is very important, and it's something that needs to be better understood. But just to kind of put it a little bit more broadly, I think the good news is that norms do change. And so just if we look at, for example, girls' education, 10 or 20 years ago, there were enormous gaps in even primary school completion rates for girls, let alone secondary school. Now, even in low-income countries, the gap is within 5 percentage points. So that's an enormous, if you like, revolution almost in thinking in terms of assumptions about kind of the value of the girl child, whether or not she should go to school. And then we see that in countries like Bangladesh and in India, where they've kind of had specific programs. So I don't want to underplay kind of the importance of the media and how that can work, but I think that through programs, public programs, which open up accessibility, in some cases through kind of stipends and scholarships and initiatives to try and promote kind of particular values, kind of change can come about that way as well.
I have to say I'm no expert on the kind of influencing of media, but the thing that makes me scared of this is when the government gets in the middle of it. And so for me, it's a question of the NGOs, the civil society groups to come in, do the research, engage. We have, now that doesn't mean that there isn't some place for the government to be involved. In fact, in the school system, it's just ridiculous that there's less than one full session on reproductive health. So in our schools in DC, we have a 45-minute session on it per the whole year. That's just ridiculous. So you're not going to get past the false kind of understanding of what reality is unless you grapple that more, I think, in the schools, in the health centers, and then the kind of education efforts you can do from the outside with billboards and just combating what sells. That's the problem is. Yeah. That stuff sells, and so you have to, I think, re-educate.
Just to add that in small island developing states, such as in the Caribbean, the media can have a significant impact if managed. And we've learned lessons in terms of HIV prevention, reproductive health promotion campaigns have been very successful when the state has become involved. It gets, I think, more challenging when the values and issues that have to be addressed have not been examined by the policymakers themselves, when you get into things like gender, etc. So the mechanism is there, and there are models that have been used. It is, again, for us to advocate and find ways to find the right lyrics to sell this message to the policymakers and the state to support these initiatives.
We've had some engagement with TV Globo on the question about Brazil. They do have a social, TV Globo, for those of you who don't know, it's probably 60% of the television market in Brazil's 200 million. Its telenovelas are watched, by millions every night. They have incorporated some messages over time. They've often not been as cutting edge or as, deeply pushing the edge as we might want. We engaged with them once on the issue of violence against women and engaging men as part of the solution. It was kind of one step forward, 2 steps back. That is, they got the need to talk about how we engage men in that process. At the same time, the solution to a violent man was the boyfriend came and killed the violent husband. We found that problematic as a violence prevention message. They've done some work. There's now more gay characters in the telenovelas, but certainly as we've worked with some gay rights activists and certainly some of our staff saying, they've really presented in kind of stereotypical ways. So on the one hand, trying to normalize certain issues and push the edge in appropriate ways, at other times, falling into really simplistic stuff. We've watched some of the work and connected with the folks at the Gina Davis Institute who are trying to analyze women's roles in media and trying to, their kind of model is working from within. So using the power of, Gina Davis's voice to shame her. And I do think that shaming role of us as civil society, the kind of the line between censorship and saying, wait a minute, we can both raise educated children who think critically about these messages they're seeing, as Peter was saying, but also how do we, be a civil society voice pushing back. I want to acknowledge the last two questions and see if anybody wants to comment on the Cuba question. I think a fascinating example of, what is it like to create community? Why is there a sense of safety that's hard to find in other parts of the world? Not sure if anybody wants to comment quickly on that one, but I think a very interesting example of saying it is possible to imagine parts of the world where even poverty is quite a challenge, but maybe inequality is not quite the issue. Are we talking an issue of inequality, not poverty? I don't know if anybody wants to comment on that question.
Well, yeah, we don't work in Cuba, I'm afraid. But I think it's a good point, and I think it's important to kind of realize that there are different societies normalize different levels of violence. So I'm from Australia, the very strict handgun. I mean, not saying there's a lot of domestic violence, but people don't get shot on the street, in the way that they do in some other parts of the world. So I think it's important not to think broadly and to think about kind of different ways in which societies and communities operate, and not necessarily take kind of the bad stuff as given, but to think about kind of what can change and kind of what works in different places. Yeah.
I just had one little piece of data. Jamaica and Trinidad. The kilowatt hour cost of electricity in Jamaica is $1.35 approximately US. I don't know what it is in the US. In Trinidad, it's 0.03 cents. You get the difference in terms of what it represents about the economy. Trinidad is an oil-producing nation. Okay. The last murder rate I saw in Jamaica was, I think, like about 39 per 100,000, and Trinidad is about 20.
David, maybe we'll work this way and then we'll close.
I think in the long run, again, here in D.C., the long run for me is that really creating one city with these solutions and recognizing that, when one ward in the city rises up and there's less violence and there's better education, then really the whole city gets better. And then recognizing also that some parts of the city that think they're not part of the problem actually are part of the problem, and we have to be willing to call that out. And I think as leaders in the city, we have an obligation to say everybody has to step up to be a part of the solution for this around violence and health and education, and that's really tough. So what we do is, at least in my office, is we hold forums and meetings about the policy changes I want in every sector equally to try to bring the conversation together. It's remarkable, though, the difference in reaction, especially around education. In more wealthy parts of the city, education is a conversation about their child, individual child. In poorer parts of the city, education is a conversation about the community as a whole. And that's remarkable. There's something to be learned there on both sides of the conversation. So, I don't know. I think it's partly just speaking to it. We were in Ward 8, which is Anacostia, on Saturday, meeting with a colleague of mine over there who's worked there for many years with poor kids that need the help, and he spends a lot of time with them. He's a reverend, and he made the point that these kids have huge struggles, but you wouldn't even know they're happening if you didn't come over here and see it. And that if we could just get more of the population of this region to go and be on Martin Luther King Avenue, go and be in Congress Heights or Anacostia for a day, you would see that it's not just wild, wild west every day. There is occasional shootings, and that is scary. But the more we engage, the more we're part of the solution. And the stories that he tells are dramatic. But he feels like it's everybody's responsibility to be part of the solution. So I think you just have to recognize that you're not immune from the from being a part of the final solution to all these issues. So.
Peter, any reflections on that?
You know, we talk a lot about diversity, and in the Caribbean, of course, we have significant diversity in ethnicity, religion, language, etc. But you know, the diversity issue that gets lost a lot is socioeconomic status. We forget sometimes about factoring that into our equation. And one of the implications of it is that sometimes we target our programs at what seems to be the larger underclass who needs the work, not understanding that the change needs to take place across the spectrum. And one of the implications of that, and we saw it happen in Jamaica with one program that was targeting fathers that was developed in the 80s, very good program. But the leader of the program insisted that it should only be for lower class men. It needed to be for the grassroots because they had the greatest need. And there were two outcomes. One is that the other classes didn't get the impact of this parenting and fatherhood program. But the more important one is that the men who had the deeper pockets, who could have been financiers and supporters and policy influencers, didn't get influenced. And that program is virtually non-functional. So there are many win-win dynamics about working across classes.
It's clearly one of universality. So to go back to Australia again, if you look at a map of the world and look at kind of rates of prevalence of violence, it ranges as high as 43% in South Asia, which has the highest rates in the world, but it's around almost 30% in Australia and New Zealand, which is a very wealthy part of the world. And so they're problems and challenges which are really quite systemic and deeply rooted. Having said that, the challenges that we see among disadvantaged groups are actually much more severe in many ways in terms of the risks and the severity and so on in many countries, although not everywhere. So for example, in South Africa, it seems to be kind of pretty similar across all income strata, but in lots of countries, in India, Nicaragua and other places, it's much worse across the poor. I mean, my broad sense is that in kind of countries and communities where people are educated and they have resources and so on, there should be many more opportunities, you know, in terms of entry points and making a difference. And it's somehow about, you know, beginning to have the conversations and so on, so that things change.
Yeah. I'll maybe just offer one final reflection on that, because I think it is a good question. One, we worry in our work in Brazil and elsewhere that we don't want our approaches being seen as these are only for the poorest of the poor. They've got problems and the middle class doesn't. In our limited efforts to work with middle class in Brazil, what we've often found is both with parents and young people, there was a very strong discourse about the me and the my rights. And our work in favelas has often been about the how do we make this place collectively a better place. And we've not found ways, but what we often talk about is we'd like to see that sense that I'm a citizen who has rights is felt by the lowest income, and we'd love to see middle class in Brazil and elsewhere see themselves as part of a collective and not just consumers of individual rights. No idea how to do that, and that's a conversation to carry on after here, but that's some of the bridging that we at least keeps us up late at night. I'm really thankful for the group here and for the reflections and the comments. Thanks for accepting this, and Michael and the colleagues here at NYU, thanks for hosting us and inviting us in this lovely space. Bonnie, thanks again for the work on the documentary. Have a very good evening, and we'll be glad to chat with some of you on the way out. Thanks a lot.
If you have any questions about